Good morning. Good morning, everybody on the call. Thank you for coming and joining us on this very exciting webinar. I'm here with Peter Kestenholz,
Hello.
Head of Innovation, Head of AI, xPM Guru.
Try to be.
Many titles. And I'm Nick Freeman. I'm one of the many consultants at Projectum. So my job today is to talk as not a lot, really, and let PK kind of take the limelight. As you would have hopefully seen some communication, and probably why you're here is that we've just recently launched xPM, which is very exciting, a new concept. We've had some questions come in around xPM, so we'll go through those today. But essentially, this session is just going to be a bit of a Q&A from my end. Feel free to add anything to the chat that you like, some questions, and I can kind of feed it across to Peter and we can figure it out. But I think when I first heard about it, there was a lot of questions rattling around in my head. But let's start with the basics. And I think before we talk about what xPM is, I'd really like to know what kind of inspired the idea, why xPM, where it came about, and how it all started.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think, first of all, I've personally spent 21 years in the industry of traditional PPM, so project portfolio management or enterprise portfolio management. And since I think the last 4 or 5 years, every time we met a customer who would like to get the big picture up and running, so getting a tool for that, then we quickly learned that there was an Agile movement. So maybe it's even before 5 years ago. You saw Scrum coming in, you saw Kanban boards suddenly be put on whiteboards in different places. And if you also ask customers, like, how many of you have projects, or the organizations we spoke with, they all said we have projects. They all said that they had project managers, which is the new normal. Everyone runs projects, right? But 20 years ago, when we started Projectum, very few organizations had a project office or a project director, and only few dared to call themselves professional project managers. So I think being a project manager is perhaps something we all feel that we are. So in some sense, it's all projects we are doing, all of us, no matter what industry we are in. But then I think the way of working with your project, if we still call it a project some years ago, was that some sort of worked it like, as I said, a Kanban board. If you were in marketing, you might have an annual wheel of stuff to do and checklists and who's doing what. And in that scenario, you might be connected to, as a person, 50 projects at the same time. And if you are constructing a bridge, you might only be working for that construction project for the next 5 years. But both would still be called a project. And if you did Agile work, you were doing software development. Even in the most Agile tools I work with, when you create something new, it's still called, let's create a project. So there's a lot of project definitions, both from a role perspective and a work item perspective. So basically, what we've seen now is that we can't, traditionally speaking, force everyone into trying to stick to the plan. So essentially creating waterfall project plans using Gantt charts. If you work Agile, you do something else. You have your fixed team capacity and you try to get the most out of it. Whereas if it's a project team, the project, once it's born, have no resources, you ask for permission to get resources. It's a temporary team versus a fixed team. So the last 3, 4, 5 years, we also listened a lot into how can we ourselves inject the Agile way of working, but still into the projects. Some would argue you could call it hybrid, which means we do a little bit of both. But ultimately, and here comes, I think, why we needed to change things, is that it's not the same if you're managing a project or if you're managing an epic. It is not the same. From an execution perspective. And there are tools that are better for certain types of execution methods versus others. So instead of us trying to convince everyone that, well, it's end of day, it's all a project, then we try to take a step back and say, okay, what you're doing is actually not a project. So we will allow you to use whatever tool you want, Jira, DevOps, something else. And for those over here in the same company, you're doing like traditional projects. But the problem comes when someone says, so I want to stay on top of both worlds. What's going on in my company as a whole? or you have portfolio managers who have specified budgets that they can spend money or people in 2025 on tons of things, not just projects, but everything: programs, projects, epics, ideas, features, strategy components.
Yeah.
So xPM means, again, X anything. So we can put anything into the portfolio, but not anything that's in. So it has to be relevant, of course, to put into a portfolio. And where I often see that something becomes relevant if it comes with a cost that someone needs to say yes to. So I think the learning from us is also that regardless of you having project stage gate models, essentially we could maybe discuss that there is a business case stage gate model, like an innovation funnel for tons of ideas. We cannot afford them all. Then what do we do?
Yes.
So our tool needed to support that ideas could come in, be ranked, evaluated, approved, so the business case, and then maybe an idea becomes an epic for an agile team or product manager. Maybe it becomes a project, maybe it's a program, maybe that program is hybrid and have both agile stuff and traditional stuff. But again, we shouldn't care so much about it. It should be up to the organization we work with to define how they would like to work. And then our tool needs to support that rather than forcing them into a PPM, portfolio program project mindset. So that's sort of, I think, why we ended up where we are right now, with a lot more focus on the portfolio part and less on us forcing people to call things certain names and executing it in certain ways.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I think, that time spent on the portfolio, I think, is a really interesting point, and I want to go into that. But you've spoken a little bit about a lot of the different types of work that we all bring together and trying to take that kind of control. Now, I think back before xPM we had PPM, but we also had controlled agility. So is there any kind of major differences that you can talk about between kind of what controlled agility was and what you talked about there compared to xPM? Is there some similarities?
Yeah.
How do you see that?
Controlled agility was probably, it was phase one, where what we're doing now is probably phase two. But it was an attempt to say that our tool needed to be able to collect data from something that was not a project. So the epics or the agile teams, whatever they were doing in some tool, we needed to be able to connect to, so you can still see the big picture. But just because you can throw everything into a report from whatever source or system you use doesn't mean that you are in control. You just see that you have a problem, or you get the picture, right? So how do you manage that combination of different ways of working? So control agility gave you the control of being on top of your data, but making new scenarios and so on wasn't possible. So what we often saw was that you had a portfolio for all your agile work, and you had a portfolio for all your traditional work. You could then argue that once we can throw both into a report, well, then you get the big picture. Today, the difference between that and until now is that xPM portfolio management means that in the same portfolio, you could add lots of things. And it's not just adding projects and epics. It's also a matter of aligning the investments within that portfolio against more than money and people. And the third thing here is strategy or direction. And here we also saw, I think, over time, or especially the past 2-3 years, that the phenomenon of OKRs, for instance, objectives and key results, have really moved forward. It's part of the scaled agile framework now for those who are very agile, but it's also something that those who run projects focus on. It's for sure more than business drivers because they're static. And I think that's another point here when it comes to what matters when it's xPM, that many people have moved from long-term strategy planning, aligning against that, to short-term strategy planning. We don't know what's happening 3 months from now. And I think this is a great time to actually say that because we all know, if we're watching the news right now, we don't know what's happening tomorrow or next week. Cost-wise, the cost of running our projects, the cost of selling our project or products. So much is changing. So we need a flexible tool that can do different scenarios for if the tariff goes up or down, or then what do we do?
Very relevant.
Exactly. It's very relevant right now. So that's also portfolio management, but where one of the things you put into the portfolio is not just your projects and your epics, it's your strategy items or part of the strategy. And then that might change next month. So I think that's a big difference compared to just getting a report that could show too well.
I agree. Yeah. And that's really interesting. I mean, personally, I think one of the coolest parts of our tool has always been the OKRs. And I think as you're dead right, we're now shifting towards more people looking into objectives, but having that kind of quantitative analysis on actually how things are going against our strategic goals, increase size in APAC, whatever it might be. We're speaking a lot about the portfolios, which I think is really interesting because, you know, as we've developed PPM into xPM, as you know, as I know, as some of us others know, we've spent a lot of time in that place to develop. Maybe if we just take a step towards or take a step out of the technical side and more think about the portfolios in general. Back when we talked about PPM, we had hybrid portfolios, we had IT portfolios, we had strategic portfolios. Do you see kind of, I guess, best practice xPM, or do you see a certain structure that portfolios will have when it comes to xPM that's any different to what we talked about before, or is it just the same?
I haven't found the true common denominator yet, I think. Well, a few years back, probably, yes, then we would all have sort of the same structure. When we said hybrid, it was sort of the same thing we meant. No, I think right now what has changed is probably the hierarchy of the way you break down your work. I see that in many ways. It feels like right now that everyone is doing Agile. That was also sort of for the software engineers at some point. Now it's everyone. There's a lot of companies where it's all over the place, and some it's just for one department. But no matter how agile you are, you would most likely still have a customer who's expecting you to be done at a certain point in time, and so on and so forth. So I think in this case, it's also a matter of learning from each other. So what we can do when it comes to portfolio management is that, okay, we can't ask for agile teams to plan the next 12 months ahead and create a baseline.
No,
that will not work. But we still need to at least connect some key deliverables, because there might be dependencies from this agile team to this traditional project, and both are grouped into one large transformation program. Or, which is also important, roadmap. We see roadmaps coming as well now. So the hierarchy, in a nutshell, it's quite often, if we go at the highest point, you have a board or a bunch of shareholders who would like to know if what they're doing, or the money is spending, or the company is spending money on, is it worth it? That's one overview. And at that level, you have to also stick to the plan, because you create a budget quite often, right? And you have a strategic goal, and you even, if you're publicly traded, you share it externally as well. So people will follow up on you whether or not you've reached those goals. So it's very much a baseline, unless you do new forecasts and so on. So that's the starting point. And then most running quarters, they run with CapEx and OpEx, because that has direct impact on the bottom line. So that cockpit and that sense of control has not changed, I think. Not that I was born back then, but my guess would be since the 50s. It's the same thing you do. So the board will try to control what's going on in the business. That's the job and responsibility they say yes to. So which means that we need to inject control to some extent. So imagine you have an agile tool and you say people work the way they want in that agile tool. So team A and team B, we can't compare how they work. This one doesn't do estimates. This one doesn't have dates. This one doesn't describe what they're doing. That won't fly. So we need to find ways where we can, even if it's at this level or at that level that you have an investment you say yes to, or if it's in this tool or that tool, so sort of sideways, we need to find common ground in minimum things we can ask people to do. So when we say, how much will it cost, then you should be able to answer that, no matter if it's an epic or a project, right? So the program can see this total cost and so on. And then it might be different how you track cost and how you plan cost. And if it's a large project, maybe it's very detailed with a breakdown structure. And if it's an agile epic, maybe it's just the hours times a rate, and that's your cost for 25. But it still costs. Same thing with the plan. So how do we put deadlines on something without forcing people to create a project plan? There are many ways to do that. So no, I don't think we have a standard for the hierarchy. I've seen a lot who have, because of scaled agile, that they are sort of taking scaled agile and adding a portfolio level on top. So if there's anything I see that's going on everywhere right now, it's probably that there's a focus on the portfolio, and then there is an understanding of that also agile work items need some sort of controlling. not from the self-controlling teams itself, but actually outside of that team.
Yes.
So what we can offer is that no matter how you break down your business, we will support that breakdown, hence the X in xPM,
Yeah.
so the by design. And then we can probably advise on how do you do cost management, how do you do timelines, how do you do risk management, how do you do lessons learned, if it's agile or not agile or something in between, and you need to compare both. There are still a lot of similarities we can apply to almost all customers.
Awesome. That's really good. And I think bringing all that work together, especially in that roadmap format, is, I think, hugely powerful and something that hopefully we might get a chance to show a little bit later in the session. I just want to jump to maybe a question that we've had from Michael, because it aligns with some of the objective strategy stuff that we're talking about. So Michael has said, I appreciate how xPM links initiatives that typically change the organization and are linked to objectives, key results, driving strategy. However, we have a lot of existing processes that typically run the organization that may or may not be linked to KPIs, but typically are not associated directly to an objective. How do you reconcile this work so that the organization as a whole is focused?
Yeah,
it's a good question, Michael.
It's a good question. In past years, I think what we saw, that's probably many years ago, was like, let's say you had the Gartner model, you had the fear, fact, and faith portfolios, right? And the faith portfolio was the highly innovative, let's give it a shot portfolio. Typically 10% of your budget could go there, high risk. And then the other two were more aligned on, let's say, business as usual with some improvements.
Yeah.
And what happens is that I think if we need to separate, because I think the question here is around also you have OKRs and you have traditional business drivers that are more static. How do you sort of work with both?
Yeah.
And I think you need both. You need to be able to report on, let's say you have 5 business drivers, transformation, compliance, whatever, could growth, something that's more static, that's there every year. All projects should be, I think, aligned to at least one of them. Maybe not with a percentage, just what's the primary driver behind this project initiative. And then the problem is if you have 1,000 projects that are also proposed and they're all rated against the growth driver, then how do you select which ones to run? Because they're all into the growth bucket. And then in this case, you would typically use the ROI or something to find the most profitable project to say yes to, or with the lowest risk. But here's another perspective, which is that sometimes we also see that people say, as a whole, next year, we will maximum spend 15% on transformation projects. That's also a way to create a budget. So top down, your drivers have a priority. Your projects or investments are then connected to those priorities. And then still you'll find that you have more ideas than you can afford. So you still need the ranking, but your drivers could also be prioritized. So I would think that's the overall investment plan. Now the OKRs are different, and they're different because, in my experience, the OKRs they're temporary. First, if they're not temporary, they would probably just be drivers. So the OKRs are something where management top down says yes to a strategy, and they break down why this strategy is good into some tangible artifacts, key results. And to achieve the goal of reaching 1,000 new customers in the US next year, you need to do something. And what you need to do is then the initiatives that supports that goal.
Yes.
Now, to get key results of 1,000 new customers, someone might also add some money on it, saying that equals $50 million extra in revenue. So that's your benefits.
Yeah.
And now you have these projects below that have been identified that you need that have a cost. So it doesn't really make sense in an OKR setting where strategy gives birth to projects. It doesn't really make sense on the project level to then track the benefits because they are placed higher up. They are placed on the goal.
Yes.
So in the OKR context, you should not prioritize these strategic projects in the same bucket as you do with the other projects.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be able to say no to them, because if you say no to those projects, you essentially say no to the strategy to some extent, right?
Yes.
And here I see some sort of immaturity sometimes that people blend both worlds into one bucket, talk about ranking and prioritizing, and then they have a flag saying this is must run and this is not must run, and you're like, why is it must run?
Yeah.
Because it's strategic. And why is it strategic? Who's owning it?
Yes.
And again, in that context, it's not the project manager who probably should identify the benefits. They should just execute the project, and then benefits are owned, or the benefit realization are owned by the strategy office, if you have that. If not, the person who came up with the strategy.
Yes.
So it's two very different ways of working, having business drivers as a framework for, but say putting buckets on what you should invest in or not, with a tag and ranking stuff and selecting projects. That's one process, but OKRs is different. You start with the OKRs and then you create the supporting initiatives. The worst thing you can do, in my experience, and it's very subjective, is to take all your existing projects and just ask people to randomly connect to whatever part of the strategy they feel it connects to.
Yes.
Because what will happen is that even the most, let's say, trivial database upgrade somewhere in the server room will suddenly be connected to employee happiness or something like that. Because you could always argue that it impacted, right?
Yeah, of course.
So that's the dilemma, I think.
Yes, agreed.
That was a long answer, sorry.
No, it's good. And look, it was a really good question. I think it really helped round off, I guess, the objectives, key results, but also the difference in drivers and how we see that kind of in prioritization. So it was a really good question, Michael. We might move on to kind of just some more, I think maybe some more specifics around xPM relative to kind of our tool. We've talked a lot about the processes that go with it, but I think what I'm always most interested in is that you have a lot of other stuff that you do when it comes to projects or initiatives or epics or whatever it might be, right? You run risks, you run resources, you have financials, or some of the stuff you've already spoken about. Do you see xPM making a big change in these respects compared to how we had PPM? You know, am I able to have risks on an epic and then roll that up? Can I see financials on a program level? Can I resource my program? You know, what are your thoughts on that side of things?
Yeah, that's where the by design becomes tricky, both for us as vendors, because every component we build have to be so flexible so that it can be used either as a budget for other financial grids, or maybe it's its own budget on its own, or maybe it's something that should be rolled even further up, high up the chain. So you're right in that. Of course, we support today also that a risk matrix can be the sum of all risks, but that also means that a risk matrix or grid or just a risk should be able to connect to whatever work item a customer would like it to connect to.
Yeah.
So it's very agnostic in terms of work type. We don't care, actually. Same thing with a resource plan or a roadmap or a timeline or even documents. Whatever it is, you should be able to connect it to whatever dot you want to connect it to, which is tricky for us. And we are not as a vendor, we are probably, I'd say, 50-60% done transforming our controls so they support this. And some are still missing. We will do that until end of this year for sure. That's our direction. But it is a big change. But ultimately, from a customer standpoint, an end user, you will just experience that anything can be connected, and then you don't really see the problem. One great example is that the resource also upgrade we're working on right now. You go in as a line manager or as anyone managing people, and you add Nick. You have Nick in your grid perhaps, and you say Nick should work the next 6 months on something, and then you click work item, and that list will show you everything you can choose from, which is everything. Could be features, epics, programs, projects, but even portfolios. Doesn't matter what ideas, and you just select what you want. And in the Dataverse, in Power Apps, that way, technically speaking, is called polymorphing. It's a weird word, but essentially is one lookup. One lookup. So it seems from an end user that it's all in the same table, even though it's not. Because if it was, we had to manage everything the same way. But it looks like it's the same list you can just select from. But behind the scenes, each of these work items are managed very different. Yes. So we are upgrading all our controls to support different ways of managing the work, but it will look and feel as if it was just all projects.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's one of the big upgrades, I would say, is the resourcing side, where we can kind of take all of these work items and look at it in the same way.
Yes.
And it's easy to say, I want 50% of my time over this, or 100% of my time over 6 months, and make it very easy for the consumer. One of the questions we had kind of previous to this was kind of speaking about all of these components and obviously what's tricky for us as a vendor. The question was around, having all of these things that going on in different ways, especially from a data point of view, it can be really hard to keep control of. And I think a lot of customers that we have already met, obviously our new customers, struggle with that, to kind of keep their hands in control on a data perspective. How do you think xPM is going to kind of help that from a data point of view?
Well, everything will be stored in one container. That's a good start.
Yeah.
And I think what we have to offer, which is different than what you would elsewise do in Excel, or typically, to be honest, our number one competitor is most likely Excel and PowerPoint more than other tools.
For sure.
No, I think you want to track all the changes that are happening to your data to get something useful out of. So it's not just data now and here. It's the same thing with projects for a long time, that you have these snapshots. So project managers goes in once a month, they create new KPIs, and you can then see historically that last year, in 10 months, we had red KPI on cost, but in 2 months it was green. So that transparency is pretty normal in the project world.
Yeah.
I think in the Agile world, not a lot of people have been able to track changes over time.
Yeah.
If you go into Azure DevOps, also Jira, it's not possible, at least out of the box, to pull any historical data. What you see is what's there right now.
Yeah.
You have the same problem if you use tools like Microsoft Planner, Kanban board stuff. Again, what you see there is here and now. And if you want to sort of go back, they have done a few things now, so you have that little bit of transparency, but it's difficult in the reports. So ultimately, I think the more we can add into the tool we have, because we run full data auditing of all the changes, the better positioned you will be to see what trends are going on in your business. So it's not just a report, but you'll be able maybe to play the report.
Yes.
Maybe we can have an example of that later, but essentially adding a play button to your data.
Yes.
So play my data, and then you can see how things have progressed over the last 12 months. You can see if a project with what used to be a high ROI is suddenly dropping.
Yes.
And if you can see it's dropping week by week by week, then you can easily add the future, like then play it into the next 6 months into the future.
Yeah.
And maybe you can see it goes into a negative ROI. So the point is, we need data to be live, not real-time live in the old way, but live in the sense that you can see it floating back and forth on a timeline. So when we say this project is in red, maybe it's not a big issue, because the last 9 months straight it was all green. So it's just now it has raised a flag that it needs help for some more resources. And so I think this way of time phasing your data, seeing how things were and how it is now and how it might be next, that's where we want to move people in.
Yes.
And I know we are not speaking about AI today because that's next, but of course, having things historically snapshotted is crucial for getting any valuable output out of AI.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and we don't want to get too
that's next,
because we'll spend the next hour talking about it. Let's go. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so just a couple of questions I think we could get through. So from Cecil, we've got, I am curious if this means aligning also, for example, organizational change initiatives, or if it points towards IT task management, etc. Also, how cool would it be to track strategic progress across operational change, organizational development, or projects in a very visual way? I sometimes lack that in order to use PPM for tracking broader strategy progress than projects.
Yeah, that's true. It's the two things that I like about this is that it looks at the change part, and that's actually a more recent thing we've seen people asking about, which is the ProSci framework, which you might have heard of. I guess Cecil has for sure. But so one thing is that this project will roll out next fall. Yes, we can afford it. Yes, we have sufficient resources, and strategically, well, it makes sense. Problem is that department who will be impacted by this new change or this new project, they have 50 other changes hitting them in the same week. So this way of balancing, not against people availability and money, but just against how much can they actually absorb. Having thresholds for changes is something where we're seeing more and more people look into and actually configure in the system. It's fairly easy. We actually have a module for ProSci if you're into that, just following the book out of the box. But people have different ways to do change management. But it's essentially a change plan. But you can also see that this month it's all red because we can't take it in. It's too much. So change management is important. And then on the strategy part, yes, tracking it. The execution of strategy is something I'm asked for a lot. We also do it internally in our company. So the OKRs, who's owning the check-ins for where are we now? How many new customers did we actually get in the US?
Yes.
Are we behind our head? Not on project progress, but on strategy execution. Very much asked for. So I totally get that. And both things are part of xPM today. It is there, but we will do more with those features than we have right now for sure.
Yeah.
But if you haven't seen it or you have our tool, you can definitely enable it.
Awesome. Great. Well, look, that's all we have time for. That went past very quickly, but I think all really good stuff, and I appreciate all the questions that came across from everyone. We'll answer anything in the chat after this and send it across to you. We'll have videos and recordings out as well after this. But look, thanks everybody for joining, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks for the AI geeky talk, which will be a lot of fun. Thanks, guys.